Okay, so Unit 4, Road to Revolution, Chapter 12, Texas Wins Independence, Lesson 1, Houston and the Texas Army. We will learn that after the Alamo and Goliad, Mexican troops moved further into Texas while Texan forces retreated in disarray. Terms to know: inevitable, unavoidable; plantation, a large farm used to grow cash crops for sale; barricade, a temporary wall or barrier built to block an enemy's advance and provide cover. Here's some pictures of different men during the Texas Revolution. This is Edward Burleson. News that Santa Anna's army was heading east from San Antonio frightened Texans. Noah Smithwick, a Kentucky blacksmith, headed for Texas in 1827. Here's General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. Okay, the Texans retreat. Guiding question: how did the Texan Army and civilian Texans react to Santa Anna's continued invasion? By March 1836, the Texans' defeat seemed inevitable or unavoidable. Santa Anna was sure that his army had stopped the rebellion. The Texan army appeared to be destroyed. He considered returning to Mexico, but his officers talked him out of it. Instead, Santa Anna decided to punish the Anglo-American settlers of Texas. He ordered his soldiers to burn every town, farm, and house. Many Texans believed that independence from Mexico was now hopeless. Others, however, refused to give up the fight. Sam Houston was one of these. He had been named Commander-in-Chief of the Texas Army on March 4th, 2 days after the adoption of the Texas Declaration of Independence. When Houston joined his troops at Gonzales late in March, he found fewer than 400 men. Many had come in answer to appeals sent from the Alamo by William B. Travis. These included Tejano and Anglo-Texans and about 50 Kentucky volunteers. The men had no food and some had no guns or ammunition, but all wanted to fight. Houston formed the group into a regiment. A week after Houston arrived in Gonzales, Susanna Dickinson and Travis's servant Joe, two survivors of the Alamo, also arrived. They brought news of the battle and of Santa Anna's plans to move east to Gonzales. Houston's army was no match for the possible Mexican forces. Recognizing that a fight would be impossible at this stage, Houston ordered a retreat. Many disagreed with his decision, but Houston stood firm. He hoped to draw Santa Anna and his men farther into Texas. During the retreat, he would have time to plan, gather more men, and train his army. Houston sent an order to James Fannin at Goliad. He told Fannin to blow up the fortress and fall back east to join Houston. As news spread of Houston's retreat and the advancing Mexican army, settlers living between the Colorado and Brazos rivers fled. Soon, Stephen F. Austin's colony disappeared as settlers packed what they could and left. The event is known as the Runaway Scrape. Spring rains made the retreat difficult. The fleeing settlers were stopped by the swollen rivers. They hurriedly built rafts to carry people across. Along the route, many fell ill and died from hunger and fever. The road to San Jacinto. Guiding question: how did Houston's retreat help the Texas Army? As Texan settlers fled east, the Texas government moved to Harrisburg. Meanwhile, Houston continued his retreat. He hoped his army would be able to take advantage of any mistakes Santa Anna might make. On March 25th, Houston learned of the capture of Fannin and his men. He also learned that the Mexicans were moving toward the Colorado River. By this time, Houston's force had grown to about 1,200 men. Many of them, however, had begun to leave. They went home to look after their families. On March 30th, Houston's forces camped at a plantation or large farm used to grow cash crops on the Brazos River. For about 2 weeks, Houston trained his troops. Except for Houston and a few officers, most of the troops had no military experience. After weeks of retreating, however, Houston's soldiers were frustrated. They wanted to fight, not train. This was especially true of the Texans who had joined the army to defend their homes and families. The government was also unhappy with Houston. President David G. Burnett was angry about the general's seeming reluctance to fight. In early April, Burnett sent Secretary of War Thomas Rusk to the Texan camp to take a look at the situation. Burnett told Rusk to take command of Houston's army if Houston did not promise to engage with the Mexicans. Rusk allowed Houston to explain his plans. Satisfied, Rusk supported Houston and blocked any further criticism of him. As the days passed, Houston's men used the plantation blacksmith shop to make bullets. The men slept in the plantation's buildings and ate food from its fields. Soldiers' wives who had traveled with the army helped make sandbags for barricades or temporary barriers, and they also cared for sick soldiers. On April 7, 1836, Santa Anna's army reached the Brazos. However, troops under Mosley Baker prevented the Mexican army from crossing. After a delay of several days, Santa Anna decided to take some soldiers and move south to capture the Texan government at Harrisburg. By the time the Mexicans reached Harrisburg, the government had already fled to New Washington on Galveston Bay. Santa Anna's troops burned Harrisburg and continued to pursue the government. Meanwhile, on April 11th, Houston gained a prize. This was the Twin Sisters, two 6-pound cannons donated by the people of Cincinnati, Ohio, President Burnett's hometown. Houston had been forced to leave his artillery behind during the retreat. Now that he had the sisters, and with his men now well trained, Houston decided it was time to face the enemy.